The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Buckingham Palace as King Charles III adjusted his tie in the mirror. His reflection showed a man who had waited decades for this role, but today held special significance beyond the usual royal duties. It was exactly 1 year since he had launched the Coronation Food Project, an initiative born from his lifelong passion for sustainable agriculture and his deep concern for food waste and hunger across Britain. His private secretary knocked gently on the door. "Your Majesty, the car is ready." Charles nodded, taking one last look at the speech notes he had personally revised the night before. Unlike many royal addresses that were carefully crafted by teams of writers, this one contained his own thoughts, his own words, because this project represented something deeply personal to him. The journey through London revealed a city still struggling with the cost of living crisis. Charles observed people queuing outside food banks, families carefully counting their shopping, and restaurants with signs advertising reduced prices on meals nearing their sell-by dates. These scenes reinforced why he had insisted on creating the Coronation Food Project during his coronation year, transforming what could have been merely ceremonial celebrations into something that would create lasting change. At Highgrove House weeks before the anniversary, Charles had spent hours in meetings with project coordinators, reviewing statistics that both encouraged and troubled him. In just 1 year, the project had rescued over 2.5 million meals worth of surplus food that would have otherwise gone to waste. Yet the demand for food assistance had grown by 30% in the same period. He remembered pushing his glasses up his nose as he studied the charts, his fingers drumming on the antique desk that had belonged to his grandfather. The Coronation Food Project had emerged from a simple observation Charles had made during his years as Prince of Wales. Britain threw away millions of tons of perfectly good food each year, while millions of citizens struggled to put meals on their tables. The disconnect troubled him deeply, keeping him awake at night as he pondered solutions. He had witnessed similar initiatives during his travels abroad, particularly in France, where food waste laws had transformed how businesses handled surplus food. His team had initially been skeptical when he proposed launching such an ambitious project to coincide with his coronation. Royal initiatives typically focused on awareness raising and patronage, not the complex logistics of food redistribution. But Charles had insisted, drawing on decades of experience with his organic farming ventures and environmental campaigns. He understood that real change required more than ribbon-cutting ceremonies and photo opportunities. The project's first challenge had been bringing together organizations that had never previously collaborated. Supermarket chains viewed food banks with a mixture of pity and discomfort, while food banks often distrusted large corporations. Charles had personally chaired meetings where executives from major retailers sat across from food bank managers, community organizers, and logistics experts. His presence had a remarkable effect, breaking down barriers that had existed for years. During one particularly tense meeting at Clarence House, the CEO of a major supermarket chain had argued that liability concerns made food donation too risky. Charles had listened patiently before responding with a question that changed the entire conversation. What is the greater risk, a theoretical lawsuit, or the certainty that thousands of children will go to bed hungry tonight? The room had fallen silent, and within weeks, that same CEO became one of the project's most vocal champions. The anniversary event was being held at a community center in South London, deliberately chosen instead of a palace or grand hall. Charles had visited the location several times during the project's development, always arriving with minimal fanfare to meet volunteers and recipients. He remembered one visit where a single mother had broken down in tears, explaining how the food parcels had allowed her to keep her children fed while she searched for work. That conversation had stayed with him, reinforcing his determination to expand the project's reach. As the royal car navigated through London traffic, Charles reflected on the unexpected partnerships that had emerged. Tech companies had developed apps to connect food donors with local charities in real time. Logistics firms had volunteered their trucks and warehouses. Celebrity chefs had created recipes using commonly donated ingredients, helping recipients make nutritious meals from food bank provisions. Even schools had joined in, with students learning about food waste while organizing collection drives. The project had also revealed disturbing truths about modern Britain. Charles had been shocked to learn that many working families relied on food banks, unable to afford groceries despite having jobs. Teachers reported children arriving at school hungry, their concentration affected by empty stomachs. Elderly people chose between heating their homes and buying food. These weren't statistics in a report. They were real people whose stories Charles had heard firsthand during his visits. His approach to the project reflected lessons learned over decades of charitable work. Rather than imposing top-down solutions, he had insisted on listening to communities about their needs. Food bank managers had explained that donations often consisted of processed foods high in salt and sugar, leading to health problems among regular recipients. This insight led to partnerships with local farmers and markets to provide fresh produce, with Charles personally encouraging his tenant farmers to participate. The financial model for the project had been innovative, combining royal patronage with practical business sense. Charles had convinced major corporations that supporting food redistribution made economic sense, reducing their waste disposal costs while providing tax benefits. He had also established a fund using private donations, ensuring the project wouldn't depend solely on corporate goodwill or government support. Opposition had come from unexpected quarters. Some traditionalists within royal circles worried that such direct involvement in social issues was too political for a constitutional monarch. Charles had carefully navigated these concerns, framing the project in terms of bringing communities together rather than challenging government policy. He emphasized that addressing hunger was a moral imperative that transcended politics, drawing on religious teachings about feeding the hungry that resonated across faiths. The media coverage had been mixed initially. Some praised Charles for using his position to tackle real problems, while others cynically suggested it was merely a public relations exercise. The turning point came when investigative journalists discovered that Charles had been quietly donating produce from his organic farms to food banks for years before becoming king. This revelation transformed public perception, showing his commitment predated any ceremonial considerations. As the anniversary approached, Charles had insisted on maintaining the project's momentum rather than simply celebrating achievements. He had commissioned research into food insecurity in rural areas, discovering that countryside poverty was often hidden but equally devastating. This led to mobile food hubs that traveled to isolated communities, staffed by volunteers who understood local needs and could provide culturally appropriate food to diverse populations. The project had also influenced Charles's other royal duties. State banquets now featured menus highlighting how surplus ingredients could create elegant dishes. Garden parties included information stands about reducing food waste at home. Even diplomatic meetings incorporated discussions about international food security, with Charles sharing lessons learned from the British project with foreign leaders. His dedication sometimes worried his staff. Charles would work late into the night reviewing project reports, making notes in his distinctive handwriting about improvements and expansions. He insisted on visiting food distribution centers without advance notice, wanting to see real operations rather than stage presentations. These visits often resulted in practical changes, such as improved storage facilities or better volunteer training programs. The personal toll was significant, but Charles considered it worthwhile. He had lost weight from the demanding schedule, and his wife Camilla occasionally reminded him to slow down. But he felt energized by the project's impact, seeing tangible results from his efforts. When a volunteer showed him a letter from a child thanking the project for providing birthday cake ingredients, Charles had needed a moment to compose himself before continuing the tour. The anniversary planning had revealed the project's growth beyond initial expectations. What began with 30 participating organizations had expanded to over 300. The distribution network now covered every region of Britain, from major cities to remote Scottish islands. Sophisticated software tracked food from source to recipient, ensuring efficient distribution while maintaining dignity for those receiving assistance. Charles had particularly focused on removing stigma from food bank use. He He spoke openly about hunger as a societal challenge requiring collective action rather than individual shame. The project centers were designed to feel welcoming rather than institutional, with volunteers trained to treat recipients as neighbors rather than charity cases. Some locations included cafes where people could enjoy donated food in social settings, building community connections alongside addressing hunger. The environmental impact had exceeded projections. By redirecting food from landfills, the project had prevented thousands of tons of greenhouse gas emissions. Charles often highlighted this dual benefit, feeding people while protecting the planet, as an example of holistic thinking needed to address interconnected challenges. He had even convinced skeptical farmers that participating aligned with traditional values of avoiding waste and supporting communities. Educational components had grown organically from the project. Cooking classes taught recipients how to make nutritious meals from donated ingredients. Children learned about food systems and waste reduction through school programs. Even corporate partners reported employees becoming more conscious about food waste at home after participating in volunteer programs. Charles viewed this awareness raising as equally important as the immediate food distribution. The international interest had been unexpected but welcome. Delegations from other countries visited project sites, studying the model for potential replication. Charles had hosted private dinners where foreign dignitaries discussed food security challenges in their nations. He carefully avoided seeming prescriptive, instead sharing what worked in Britain while acknowledging that solutions must reflect local contexts and cultures. Technology had played a crucial role Charles hadn't initially anticipated. Artificial intelligence helped predict donation patterns and recipient needs. Blockchain technology ensured transparency in the distribution chain. Social media campaigns reached younger volunteers and donors. While Charles admitted struggling with some technical details, he embraced innovations that improved the project's efficiency and reach. The anniversary event would showcase these achievements while maintaining focus on future needs. Charles had rejected suggestions for elaborate celebrations, instead planning a working conference where participants would discuss expansion plans. He wanted the day to generate momentum rather than mere congratulations. His speech would acknowledge progress while emphasizing how much work remained. Personal moments had shaped Charles's understanding throughout the year. He recalled a veteran who explained how pride had initially prevented him from seeking help, until volunteers at a project center made him feel valued rather than pitted. A teenager had described how regular food parcels allowed her to focus on studies rather than worry about meals. An elderly couple had shared how the social connections formed at distribution centers mattered as much as the food itself. These stories influenced Charles's vision for the project's future. He wanted to create not just food distribution networks, but community hubs addressing multiple needs. Plans were developing for centers that combined food banks with job training, health services, and social activities. Charles believed addressing hunger required understanding its root causes and providing comprehensive support to break cycles of poverty. His business acumen, developed through decades managing the Duchy of Cornwall, proved invaluable. Charles understood that sustainable funding required diverse revenue streams. The project developed social enterprises selling surplus food to those who could afford it, using profits to subsidize free distribution. Corporate partnerships included long-term commitments rather than one-off donations. Even small innovations, like selling recipe books featuring donated ingredients, generated funds while spreading awareness. The anniversary marked not an endpoint, but a milestone in Charles's larger vision. He imagined a Britain where no one went hungry despite the abundance of food available. This wasn't naive optimism, but a practical goal based on evidence that sufficient food existed. It simply needed better distribution. The Coronation Food Project had proven that systemic change was possible when diverse stakeholders united behind a common purpose. As the royal car approached the community center, Charles could see crowds gathering despite the early hour. Volunteers wore project T-shirts with pride. Local residents had decorated the building with bunting made from recycled materials. Children from nearby schools held handmade signs thanking the king for the project. Media crews set up equipment to broadcast the event nationally. The atmosphere was celebratory, but purposeful, exactly as Charles had hoped. He thought about his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and how she might have viewed this initiative. While her approach to monarchy had been more traditional, she had understood the importance of responding to societal changes. Charles believed she would have appreciated how the project balanced royal dignity with practical action. He had even incorporated one of her favorite phrases about service into his speech, honoring her memory while charting his own path. The year had transformed Charles's understanding of kingship. Rather than simply reigning, he was actively working to improve citizens' lives. The Coronation Food Project represented a new model of royal engagement, hands-on, collaborative, and focused on measurable outcomes. Critics who had questioned what kind of king he would be now had their answer. One who used his position to convene, inspire, and drive meaningful change. His mood was indeed buoyant as the car stopped, but it was happiness tempered with determination. The anniversary was cause for celebration, but Charles knew that success would be measured not by ceremonies, but by empty food bank shelves because demand had decreased, not supply. He straightened his tie one final time, prepared to share his vision for year 2 and beyond, confident that the best of British values, compassion, innovation, and community spirit, would continue driving the project forward. The community center doors opened to reveal a transformed space that perfectly captured the spirit of the Coronation Food Project. Where once stood an aging building with peeling paint and broken windows, now existed a vibrant hub of activity. Charles paused at the threshold, genuinely moved by what local volunteers had accomplished. Handwritten welcome messages in dozens of languages reflected the diverse community the center served, while the smell of freshly baked bread wafted from the kitchen where former recipients now worked as trained bakers. Sarah Mitchell, the center's director, stepped forward to greet the king. Charles had first met her during a planning session where she had boldly challenged some of his initial assumptions about food distribution. Rather than taking offense, he had appreciated her direct approach and insights gained from 20 years running food banks. She had become one of his most trusted advisors on the project, never hesitating to share uncomfortable truths about the reality of food insecurity in modern Britain. "Your Majesty," Sarah said with a warm smile that reached her tired eyes, "welcome back. The community has been preparing for weeks." Charles noticed she wore the same simple navy dress she had worn to their first meeting, a choice he suspected was deliberate to show that funds went as services rather than administrative overhead. He had always admired her practical approach and dedication to maximizing every penny for those in need. The king's first stop was the kitchen, where a cooking class was in session. 8 women of various ages and backgrounds were learning to prepare nutritious meals using ingredients commonly available from food donations. The instructor, a chef who had volunteered after his restaurant closed during the economic downturn, was demonstrating how to transform day-old bread into a delicious breakfast casserole. Charles joined the group, rolling up his sleeves to help crack eggs while listening to their stories. Maria, a nurse working night shifts, explained how the cooking classes had revolutionized her family's eating habits. Despite working full-time, she struggled to afford fresh ingredients for her 3 children. The project not only provided food, but taught her budget-stretching techniques that made healthy eating possible. She showed Charles photos on her phone of meals she had prepared, beaming with pride at her newfound culinary skills. Another participant, elderly widower James, shared how the classes had given him purpose after his wife's death. He had never cooked during their 50-year marriage, surviving on ready meals after she passed. The project had taught him practical skills while providing social connection. He now volunteered at the center twice weekly, teaching other widowers basic cooking techniques. Charles was touched when James presented him with a jar of homemade jam, prepared using surplus fruit from the project. The conversation revealed systemic issues Charles had been working to address. Several participants were employed, but earned too much to qualify for traditional benefits, while too little to afford rising food costs. This working poor demographic had grown substantially, challenging stereotypes about who needed food assistance. Charles made mental notes to discuss this with policymakers, careful to frame it as bringing attention to community needs rather than political criticism. Moving to the distribution area, Charles observed the dignity-preserving systems implemented based on recipient feedback. Rather than pre-packed parcels, people could choose items based on dietary needs and preferences. Halal and kosher sections ensured religious requirements were met. Fresh produce from local farms was displayed attractively, making the space feel more like a market than a charity operation. Volunteers wore name badges and greeted recipients warmly, creating a welcoming atmosphere that reduced stigma. The king spent considerable time at the children's area, where young volunteers were packing weekend food bags for school children. This program had emerged from teachers' reports of students returning from weekends visibly hungry. Discreet backpacks were filled with child-friendly, nutritious options that required no cooking, ensuring children could feed themselves even if parents were absent or unable to provide meals. The young volunteers took their responsibilities seriously, understanding they were helping peers who might be in their own classes. 12-year-old Amir explained the coding system they had developed to track dietary restrictions and preferences without revealing recipients' identities. His technical skills had improved the distribution efficiency while maintaining privacy. Charles was impressed by how the project had engaged young people in meaningful work that developed both compassion and practical skills. Several youth volunteers had gone on to pursue careers in social work or logistics, inspired by their experiences. The technology integration extended beyond youth initiatives. Charles examined tablets used to coordinate real-time food rescue operations. When restaurants or supermarkets had surplus food, they could alert the system, which would dispatch volunteers to collect and distribute items before spoilage. The app showed active rescues happening across London, with animated icons representing volunteers racing against time to prevent waste. In the past hour alone, the system had saved enough food for 300 meals. A presentation in the conference room detailed the project's expansion into rural areas, an initiative particularly close to Charles's heart, given his connection to countryside communities. Rural food insecurity often remained hidden due to pride and lack of services. The project had developed innovative solutions like mobile food hubs that visited isolated villages on regular schedules. Partnerships with rural churches and community halls ensured distribution points were familiar and trusted. The Welsh farming representative showed videos of farmers donating surplus produce that would have been plowed under due to supermarket cosmetic standards. Perfectly nutritious vegetables rejected for being slightly misshapen now fed families instead of rotting in fields. Charles had personally negotiated with major retailers to relax aesthetic requirements, but progress remained slow. The project provided an alternative outlet that benefited both farmers and hungry families. Financial sustainability dominated discussions as Charles met with corporate partners. The CEO of a major logistics company explained how participating had transformed company culture. Employees volunteered enthusiastically, improving morale and team cohesion. The positive publicity had attracted new clients who valued social responsibility. What began as charitable giving had become integral to their business model, exactly the type of systemic change Charles had envisioned. The meeting revealed impressive statistics about corporate engagement. Over 50 major companies now participated regularly, contributing not just money, but expertise and resources. Technology firms had donated software development. Marketing agencies created campaigns pro bono. Legal firms provided free services navigating food safety regulations. This skills-based volunteering multiplied the project's impact far beyond what traditional donations could achieve. Charles particularly enjoyed meeting the food heroes, individuals whose innovative approaches had solved specific challenges. There was a retired engineer who designed collapsible crates that made food transport more efficient. The grandmother who organized her entire apartment building to donate excess food regularly. The teenager who created viral social media campaigns reaching millions. Each person had identified a problem and developed solutions, proving that meaningful change came from grassroots innovation. The health impact presentation provided sobering context. Doctors reported significant improvements in patients who received regular nutritious food through the project. Diabetes management became easier when people could afford appropriate diets. Children's concentration improved with reliable meals. Mental health benefits were equally significant, with reduced anxiety about food security, allowing people to focus on other life challenges. The project had become an unofficial public health intervention. Lunchtime showcased the project's educational component. Charles joined 200 people for a meal prepared entirely from rescued food by culinary students. The sophisticated menu challenged perceptions about food bank ingredients, featuring dishes that wouldn't seem out of place in upscale restaurants. Students explained how learning to work with variable ingredients had improved their creativity and adaptability, skills valuable in professional kitchens. The meal provided networking opportunities Charles had deliberately encouraged. He observed a small business owner discussing potential employment with a food bank recipient. A retired teacher offered tutoring to a struggling student. A healthcare worker connected an elderly gentleman with services he hadn't known existed. These organic connections demonstrated how bringing diverse people together around food created community bonds extending far beyond hunger relief. Environmental data presented after lunch reinforced the project's climate benefits. Food waste reduction had prevented emissions equivalent to taking thousands of cars off roads. Composting programs for genuinely unusable food had created nutrient-rich soil for community gardens. Some centers had installed solar panels and rainwater collection systems, becoming models for sustainable operations. Charles saw this environmental aspect attracting younger supporters who might not otherwise engage with hunger relief. The youth panel that followed energized the entire room. Young people aged 16 to 25 share how the project had influenced their lives and aspirations. Several had experienced food insecurity themselves before becoming advocates and volunteers. They spoke eloquently about breaking stigma cycles and creating systemic change. Their recommendations for expanding youth engagement were practical and innovative, including partnerships with universities and apprenticeship programs. One young woman's story particularly resonated. She had relied on food banks throughout university while studying social work. Rather than feeling ashamed, the project's dignified approach had inspired her thesis on food justice. She now worked full-time coordinating student volunteer programs, having transformed personal experience into professional expertise. Charles made a note to explore scholarship programs for young people like her who showed exceptional dedication. The Corporate Social Responsibility Workshop demonstrated evolved thinking about business engagement. Rather than viewing charity as separate from operations, companies were integrating social impact into core strategies. A supermarket chain had redesigned stores to facilitate food rescue. A technology company had made volunteer hours part of performance reviews. A restaurant group had standardized surplus donation procedures across all locations. These systemic changes ensured sustainability beyond individual enthusiasm. Cultural considerations received dedicated attention, reflecting Britain's diverse population. The project had developed guidance for handling unfamiliar ingredients, with recipe cards in multiple languages. Community elders from various backgrounds advised on cultural sensitivities. Holiday-specific distributions ensured everyone could celebrate traditions regardless of economic circumstances. Charles was particularly pleased that the project brought communities together while respecting differences. The volunteer recognition ceremony moved many to tears. Charles personally thanked individuals who had given thousands of hours to the project. There was Margaret, who at 85 coordinated her entire retirement home's participation. The Singh family, who opened their restaurant weekly to provide free meals using donated ingredients. Former military personnel who applied logistics expertise to improve distribution efficiency. Each volunteer represented countless others whose dedication made the project possible. Mental health support had become an unexpected but vital component. Volunteers received training to recognize signs of distress and provide appropriate referrals. Some centers had partnered with counseling services to offer support alongside food assistance. The holistic approach acknowledged that food insecurity rarely existed in isolation from other challenges. Charles heard how addressing hunger often provided stability, enabling people to tackle other problems. The afternoon workshop on scaling impact challenged participants to think bigger. Could the model work internationally? How might technology further improve efficiency? What role could schools play in normalizing food sharing? The discussions were frank about obstacles while maintaining optimism about possibilities. Charles contributed insights from international contacts interested in replication, careful to emphasize adaptation rather than imposing British approaches elsewhere. Legal and regulatory achievements deserve celebration. The project had successfully advocated for legislation protecting food donors from liability, removing a major barrier to corporate participation. Tax incentives for food donation had passed with cross-party support. Food safety regulations have been clarified to enable more donations while maintaining public health standards. These boring but essential changes had created an enabling environment for expansion. The surprise presentation from children at local schools delighted Charles. They had created artwork depicting the project's impact, with colorful murals showing food journeys from farm to family. Their songs about reducing waste and sharing plenty brought smiles to everyone present. Several children presented business plans they had developed for reducing school cafeteria waste, showing how project values had influenced even the youngest participants. Charles took time to visit the memorial wall honoring volunteers who had passed away during the project's first year. Their families had requested donations to the project instead of flowers, creating legacy funds supporting ongoing operations. He placed flowers beneath photographs, while Sarah shared memories of each person's contributions. The moment reminded everyone that behind statistics were real people whose lives touched others through service. The Employment Support Program represented evolution beyond initial plans. Recognizing that sustainable food security required income stability, several centers had added job training and placement services. Commercial kitchens trained aspiring chefs using donated ingredients. Office skills workshops prepared people for administrative roles. Interview clothing banks ensured people could present themselves professionally. The integrated approach addressed root causes rather than symptoms alone. Transportation innovations had solved distribution challenges in underserved areas. Electric cargo bikes navigated narrow urban streets efficiently. Volunteer drivers used apps optimizing routes for multiple deliveries. Partnerships with public transport allowed free travel for volunteers. Some rural areas had implemented food delivery combined with social check-ins for isolated elderly residents. Each solution reflected local needs and resources. The research presentation highlighted evidence-based improvements. Academic partnerships had produced rigorous studies on project impact. Data showed reduced hospital admissions in areas with strong project presence. School attendance improved where weekend feeding programs operated. Crime rates dropped in neighborhoods where community centers created positive gathering spaces. This evidence strengthened cases for continued funding and expansion. International observers shared perspectives on adapting the model globally. Representatives from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand had studied operations throughout the day. European Union officials explored whether similar initiatives could work across national borders. African delegates discussed how community-based approaches might address different but related challenges. Charles facilitated discussions while emphasizing that solutions must reflect local contexts. The anniversary celebration continued with cultural performances by groups representing communities served by the project. Bengali dancers, Caribbean steel drums, Polish folk singers, and British youth orchestras created a rich tapestry of sound and movement. The performances weren't just entertainment, but affirmations of dignity and cultural wealth existing regardless of economic circumstances. Charles joined dancing briefly, his genuine enjoyment evident to all present. As evening approached, preparation began for the anniversary dinner. Unlike typical royal events with elaborate multi-course meals, This featured a buffet prepared by project beneficiaries who had completed culinary training. The menu celebrated British diversity with dishes from various cultural traditions, all prepared using rescued ingredients. Former food bank recipients now worked as professional caterers, serving meals to supporters who had helped transform their lives. Charles mingled throughout dinner, avoiding the head table to speak with as many attendees as possible. He heard from a businessman who had restructured his company to prioritize social impact after volunteering. A teacher shared how project partnerships had enriched curriculum while addressing weekend hunger. A grandmother explained how regular food deliveries had allowed her to care for grandchildren while their parents worked multiple jobs. Each conversation reinforced the project's multifaceted impact. The evening program featured testimonials from project participants across Britain via video link. A fishing community in Scotland shared how connecting with urban food banks had created markets for fish that would have been discarded. Welsh farmers demonstrated preservation techniques taught to recipients to extend donated produce usability. Northern England factories showed employee volunteer programs that had improved workplace culture. The nationwide scope demonstrated what could be achieved through coordinated effort. Young entrepreneurs presented businesses spawned by project connections. A jam-making cooperative used surplus fruit to create products sold in shops, with profits supporting free distribution. A catering company specialized in events using rescued food, challenging perceptions about ingredient quality. A technology startup had developed improved food matching algorithms, with major retailers as clients. These enterprises proved that social good and business success weren't mutually exclusive. The Volunteer Coordinator Training Program graduation ceremony provided an emotional highlight. 20 individuals who had started as food bank recipients had completed intensive training to manage distribution centers themselves. They understood firsthand the importance of dignity and respect in service delivery. Several already had job offers from expanding project locations. Their transformation from recipients to leaders embodied the empowerment Charles had envisioned. Panel discussions on future challenges maintained realistic perspectives despite celebratory atmosphere. Rising living costs meant more working families needed assistance. Climate change threatened food production stability. Political uncertainties could affect funding and support. Rather than dampening spirits, acknowledging challenges motivated participants to strengthen resilience and sustainability. Charles appreciated the mature approach to long-term planning. The surprise announcement of a youth innovation fund generated excitement. Recognizing that young people often had fresh perspectives on entrenched problems, the project would provide grants for youth-led initiatives addressing food insecurity. Applications would open to anyone under 25 with ideas for local solutions. Charles had personally contributed seed funding, hoping to inspire similar generosity from others attending. Several corporate representatives immediately pledged support. Technology demonstrations showed next-generation solutions under development. Artificial intelligence predicted donation patterns more accurately, reducing waste further. Blockchain technology created transparent tracking from donor to recipient. Mobile apps gamified volunteering to engage younger participants. Virtual reality training prepared volunteers for various scenarios. While Charles admitted struggling with technical details, he understood their potential for scaling impact. The anniversary event's final session focused on the deeply personal stories that had shaped the project's evolution throughout its first year. Charles sat among the audience rather than on the stage, wanting to hear these testimonies as an equal participant rather than from a position of elevation. The room fell silent as Patricia Williams, a former head teacher, took the microphone with hands that trembled slightly from emotion rather than age. Patricia's story began 2 years ago when her husband's sudden illness had forced her early retirement to become his caregiver. Despite 40 years in education and careful financial planning, medical costs and reduced income had gradually depleted their savings. She described the shame of a woman who had spent decades nurturing young minds, finding herself unable to afford groceries. The day she first visited a food bank remained vivid, circling the building 3 times before finding courage to enter. What she discovered inside had changed her perspective entirely. Rather than the judgment she feared, Patricia found volunteers who treated her with the same respect she had shown her students. The project's approach of allowing choice rather than providing predetermined parcels had preserved her dignity. She selected familiar ingredients that accommodated her husband's dietary restrictions, while volunteers shared recipes and encouragement. Within months, she was volunteering herself, using her educational skills to develop nutrition workshops. Charles listened intently as Patricia explained how the project had revealed hidden poverty among professionals. Teachers, nurses, and social workers people society depended upon increasingly relied on food assistance. Her volunteer work had connected her with former colleagues facing similar struggles, creating an informal support network. They shared strategies for managing limited resources while maintaining professional appearances that their roles demanded. The king made notes about exploring specific support for essential workers. The next speaker, Marcus Chun, represented a different demographic entirely. At 28, he embodied the precarious gig economy affecting millions of young Britons. Despite holding a master's degree in engineering, he had cycled through temporary contracts and freelance projects for 5 years. The irregular income made budgeting impossible, with weeks of plenty followed by months of scarcity. He had discovered the project during a particularly lean period when 3 clients had simultaneously delayed payments. Marcus's experience challenged stereotypes about who needed food assistance. He worked 60-hour weeks when projects were available, lived in shared accommodation to minimize costs, and had no expensive habits. Yet the systemic instability of modern employment had left him vulnerable. The project had provided not just food, but stability during uncertain times. He had used saved money from food costs to invest in additional training, eventually securing more stable employment. Now he volunteered teaching computer skills to other participants. His testimony highlighted how the project addressed modern poverty's complexity. Traditional welfare systems often failed people like Marcus who earned too much during busy periods to qualify for assistance, but faced genuine hardship during gaps. The project's flexible approach had accommodated these fluctuations, providing support when needed without bureaucratic barriers. Charles recognized this adaptability as crucial for addressing 21st century challenges. Dr. Amara Okafor brought a medical perspective to the discussion. As a general practitioner in East London, she had watched patients' health deteriorate due to poor nutrition caused by poverty rather than ignorance. She prescribed medications for conditions that proper diet could prevent or manage, knowing patients couldn't afford the food she recommended. The frustration of treating symptoms while root causes remained unaddressed had nearly driven her from medicine. The Coronation Food Project had transformed her practice's approach. By partnering with local distribution centers, she could now prescribe food parcels alongside traditional treatments. Diabetic patients received appropriate ingredients with meal plans. Pregnant women accessed prenatal nutrition previously beyond their means. Children with growth concerns got protein-rich options their families couldn't otherwise provide. The integration of food assistance with healthcare had improved outcomes dramatically. Dr. Okafor shared specific cases that illustrated broader patterns. An elderly man's recurring infections had ceased once proper nutrition strengthened his immune system. A teenager's behavioral problems had improved when hunger no longer disrupted concentration. A new mother's postpartum depression had lifted partially through community connections formed at cooking classes. These stories demonstrated how addressing food insecurity created ripple effects throughout society. The business community's evolution was represented by David Thompson, CEO of a major retail chain. He candidly admitted initial skepticism when Charles had first approached him about participation. His board had worried about liability, logistics, and shareholder reactions to donating rather than discounting surplus food. The first meeting at Buckingham Palace had felt like obligation rather than opportunity, with David prepared to make minimal commitments to avoid royal disappointment. What changed his perspective was visiting a distribution center with Charles, seeing efficient operations that rivaled commercial logistics. Volunteers handled donated products with care that exceeded some paid workers. Recipients expressed genuine gratitude that made abstract corporate social responsibility tangible. David had returned to his board with enthusiasm rather than reluctance, proposing comprehensive participation that exceeded anything they had initially considered. The transformation extended beyond corporate policy to company culture. Store employees had embraced food rescue responsibilities, taking pride in contribution beyond sales figures. Customer feedback was overwhelmingly positive, with many choosing their stores specifically because of project participation. Shareholder meetings that once focused solely on profits now celebrated social impact alongside financial performance. David's own children had started volunteering, strengthening family bonds through shared service. Technical innovation featured prominently through Jennifer Singh's presentation. As a software developer who had experienced food insecurity while bootstrapping her startup, she understood both the problem and potential solutions intimately. Her app connecting food donors with recipients in real time had started as a weekend project born from personal frustration with existing systems inefficiencies. What began with 20 users had grown to handle thousands of daily transactions. The development process had revealed unexpected challenges. Food safety regulations varied by locality, requiring complex algorithm adjustments. Dietary restrictions needed sophisticated filtering without compromising user privacy. Matching perishable donations with immediate needs demanded precise timing. Jennifer's team had solved each problem through intensive consultation with actual users rather than making assumptions. The result was technology that genuinely served community needs. Her success had attracted major investment, but Jennifer had maintained the app's free availability for charitable use. Revenue came from commercial clients who used modified versions for internal food waste reduction. This sustainable business model demonstrated how social enterprises could thrive financially while maintaining charitable missions. Charles was particularly interested in how technology could scale solutions without losing human connections that made the project special. The rural perspective came through William MacLeod, a Scottish Highland farmer who had initially resisted involvement. His family had farmed the same land for 8 generations, maintaining proud independence through countless challenges. The suggestion that his surplus produce might go to food banks had felt like admitting failure after centuries of self-sufficiency. His wife had convinced him to attend a project meeting mainly to maintain good relations with the estate. What William discovered had challenged his preconceptions entirely. Urban food insecurity wasn't about laziness or poor choices, but systemic failures beyond individual control. Meeting recipients who worked multiple jobs yet couldn't afford food had shaken his assumptions. Learning that his surplus potatoes could feed families rather than livestock had transformed waste into purpose. His participation had grown from reluctant donations to enthusiastic leadership of regional agricultural involvement. The changes extended to his rural community. Other farmers had followed his example, creating informal networks ensuring surplus food reached those needing it. Rural food insecurity, often hidden by pride and distance, was being addressed through mobile distribution points. Churches and community halls had become collection centers, strengthening social bonds weakened by rural isolation. William now spoke at agricultural conferences, encouraging peers to recognize their role in addressing hunger. Educational impact was powerfully illustrated by Rebecca Martinez, a secondary school headmistress in Manchester. She had noticed declining student performance correlating with economic downturns, but initially attributed it to various factors. When teachers reported students secretly sharing lunch because some had none, she investigated further. The discovery that over 40% of her students experience food insecurity at home had shocked her into action. Partnering with the Coronation Food Project had transformed her school's approach. Weekend food bags ensured students returned Monday ready to learn. Breakfast clubs using donated ingredients started days with nutrition and community. Cooking classes taught practical skills while addressing immediate needs. The School Garden Project connected curriculum with food production, giving students agency in addressing challenges. Academic performance had improved dramatically, with attendance reaching record levels. Rebecca's innovation had extended beyond direct food provision. Students designed business plans for reducing cafeteria waste. Science classes analyzed nutrition using donated ingredients. History lessons explored food justice movements. Art students created murals celebrating cultural food traditions. The integration across subjects had made food security relevant to every aspect of education. Several graduates had pursued careers in sustainable agriculture or social work, inspired by their experiences. The religious community's involvement was represented by Rabbi Sarah Goldstein, Imam Muhammad Hassan, and Reverend Michael O'Brien, who had formed an unlikely partnership. Their congregations had historically operated separate charitable efforts with minimal interaction. The project had brought them together through shared distribution centers, requiring coordination to meet diverse dietary requirements. Initial meetings had been cautiously polite, focusing on logistics rather than fellowship. Working together had revealed shared values, transcending theological differences. All three faiths emphasized feeding the hungry as religious obligation. Their congregations included both donors and recipients, breaking down barriers between helper and helped. Joint volunteer efforts had fostered understanding impossible through interfaith dialogues alone. Young people from different faiths had formed friendships through service, creating hope for future harmony. Their collaboration had influenced broader community relations. Joint fundraising events celebrated diversity while addressing common challenges. Shared commercial kitchens prepared culturally appropriate meals efficiently. Religious festivals became opportunities for mutual support rather than separation. The practical focus on addressing hunger had achieved what decades of formal interfaith initiatives hadn't: genuine community built through action rather than words. Charles found himself deeply moved by testimony from Sarah Chun, whose family's restaurant had participated from the project's beginning. Her parents had arrived from Hong Kong 30 years ago with nothing but determination and cooking skills. Their small restaurant had survived recessions, changing neighborhoods, and family tragedies through community support. When the pandemic had nearly forced closure, loyal customers had kept them afloat through donations and takeaway orders. Participating in the project had been their way of repaying community kindness. Every evening, they prepared extra portions using ingredients that would otherwise spoil. Their chef created recipes specifically for common food bank ingredients, sharing them freely with recipients. The restaurant had become an informal community center where people gathered regardless of ability to pay. Sarah's parents, despite limited English, communicated care through carefully prepared food. The impact had transformed their business model. Customers began paying forward meals for those who couldn't afford them. Corporate events chose their venue specifically because of social commitment. Young chefs sought apprenticeships to learn both cooking skills and community values. The restaurant's success proved that businesses could prioritize community welfare while remaining profitable. Sarah now managed operations, while her parents focused on mentoring others establishing similar enterprises. Mental health dimensions emerged through Dr. James Patterson's presentation. As a psychiatrist specializing in trauma, he had observed correlations between food insecurity and psychological distress that traditional treatment couldn't address. Patients' anxiety about affording food undermined therapeutic progress. Medication compliance suffered when choosing between prescriptions and groceries. The chronic stress of uncertain food access created physiological changes complicating mental health treatment. Integrating food assistance with mental health services had yielded remarkable results. Patients receiving regular food support showed improved treatment engagement. Group cooking classes provided social connection, combating isolation. The rhythms of meal preparation offered structure beneficial for various conditions. Reducing food anxiety had created mental space for addressing other challenges. Dr. Patterson now prescribed food security as readily as medication. His research had documented biological mechanisms linking nutrition with mental health. Inflammatory responses triggered by poor diet exacerbated depression and anxiety. Blood sugar fluctuations from irregular eating affected mood stability. Nutritional deficiencies impaired neurotransmitter production, essential for emotional regulation. Addressing these physical factors through proper nutrition had enhanced traditional psychiatric treatment's effectiveness. The project had inadvertently become a public mental health intervention. Environmental benefits received attention through Professor Elizabeth Hawkins's analysis. Her team had calculated the project's carbon footprint reduction, finding impacts exceeding initial projections. Food waste prevention had eliminated methane emissions from landfills. Reduced packaging from direct distribution had decreased plastic waste. Local sourcing had shortened transportation distances. Community gardens using composted waste had created carbon sinks. The cumulative effect equaled removing thousands of vehicles from roads annually. Beyond direct environmental benefits, the project had influenced broader behavioral changes. Participants reported increased awareness about food waste in their homes. Children educated through school programs had influenced family habits. Businesses had adopted waste reduction practices beyond donation programs. The normalization of food rescue had shifted cultural attitudes about consumption and waste. Environmental consciousness had grown organically from practical engagement rather than abstract campaigns. Future sustainability occupied significant discussion time. Climate change threatened agricultural production, potentially reducing donation availability while increasing need. Economic uncertainties could affect both corporate support and recipient numbers. Political changes might alter regulatory environments. Technological disruptions could transform food systems entirely. Rather than causing despair, acknowledging these challenges had motivated proactive planning. Adaptation strategies were already being implemented. Diverse funding sources reduced dependence on any single supporter. Skills training prepared participants for changing job markets. Community gardens increased local food production capacity. Technology investments improved efficiency to serve more people with fewer resources. International partnerships shared learning and resources across borders. The project was building resilience rather than merely responding to current needs. Charles participated actively in workshop discussions about expansion. Should the project remain focused on Britain or share models internationally? How could success be measured beyond meals distributed? What role should government play versus private sector? These questions lacked simple answers, but the collaborative exploration had generated innovative approaches. The king's willingness to engage with complexity rather than seeking simple solutions had impressed participants. The anniversary celebration was concluding, but energy remained high. Volunteers exchanged contact information to maintain connections formed throughout the day. Corporate representatives scheduled follow-up meetings to expand involvement. Community leaders planned local events to maintain momentum. The atmosphere resembled movement building rather than mere celebration. Charles felt profound satisfaction seeing organic leadership emerging beyond royal patronage. His closing speech would acknowledge achievements while emphasizing work remaining. He had crafted words carefully to inspire continued commitment without claiming personal credit for collective accomplishments. The project belonged to communities who had embraced its vision and adapted it to local needs. His role had been catalyst and convener, but sustainable change came from grassroots ownership. This understanding shaped his approach to modern monarchy. As Charles prepared to address the gathering, he reflected on lessons learned throughout the year. Traditional charity models treating symptoms had evolved into systemic change addressing causes. Dignity and choice had proven more powerful than simple provision. Diverse partnerships had achieved what no single organization could accomplish alone. Technology had enhanced rather than replaced human connections. Communities had demonstrated remarkable resilience when given resources and respect. The transformation in his own understanding was equally significant. Theoretical knowledge about poverty had become visceral understanding through personal encounters. Abstract statistics had become friends whose struggles he comprehended intimately. His privileged position had found purpose through practical service. The weight of inherited responsibility had lightened through sharing leadership with communities. He had discovered that modern monarchy could remain relevant through genuine engagement with contemporary challenges. The community center had grown quiet as evening approached, but its impact would continue rippling outward. Every person present would return to their communities with renewed energy and ideas. Every story shared would inspire others facing similar challenges. Every connection formed would strengthen networks of mutual support. The anniversary marked not an end, but an inflection point in an ongoing movement for food justice. Outside, the city lights were beginning to twinkle as Charles made his final preparations. London sprawled before him, containing millions of stories like those he had heard today, in tower blocks and suburban homes, in rural cottages and urban flats. People were sitting down to meals made possible by collective action. Children were going to bed with full stomachs. Elderly people were enjoying nutrition and companionship. Workers were finding stability despite economic precarity. The Coronation Food Project had proven that seemingly intractable problems could be addressed through coordinated effort. It had demonstrated that business success and social responsibility could align. It had shown that diverse communities could unite around shared values. It had revealed reserves of compassion and creativity waiting to be mobilized. Most importantly, it had transformed charity into justice, making food access a right rather than privilege. Charles thought about his grandchildren and the world they would inherit. Climate change, inequality, and technological disruption would create unprecedented challenges. But today's gathering had reinforced his optimism about human capacity for adaptation and mutual support. If communities could transform food waste into nourishment, stigma into dignity, and isolation into connection, they could address whatever challenges arose. The project had become proof of possibility. His final notes include announcements about Phase 2 expansions. New distribution centers would open in underserved areas. Technology platforms would connect more donors with recipients. Educational programs would expand to reach more schools. International partnerships would share learning globally. Corporate engagement would deepen through innovative models. Government collaboration would strengthen through policy advocacy. Each initiative built on foundations established during year one. The king understood that sustainable change required patience and persistence. Quick wins mattered for maintaining momentum, but lasting transformation took generations. He was planting trees under whose shade he might never sit, following traditions of long-term thinking inherent in constitutional monarchy. The project would outlive him, becoming part of national fabric rather than personal legacy. This permanence motivated careful institution building. Staff members were beginning to signal that departure time approached. Charles had other engagements that evening, the endless round of royal duties that filled his calendar. But nothing would feel quite as significant as what he had witnessed today. The stories would stay with him, influencing how he approached every aspect of his role. He had found his defining purpose as king, using convening power to address fundamental challenges facing the realm.